All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are digging into a truly massive historical standoff from the 17th century. On one side, you have the Maratha Empire, which was this incredibly powerful, rapidly expanding sovereign state in India. And on the other, the British East India Company, a relentless corporate entity trying to plant its flag all over the global trade map. We're going to break down exactly how these two powerhouses interacted and how the Marathas essentially drew a line in the sand, setting up some seriously strict boundaries to contain British ambitions right from the get-go.
So that brings us to a really fascinating question. How exactly did a booming Indian empire force the ambitious British East India Company to play by its own strict rules? History often skips ahead to focus on later British dominance, but our source material reveals this whole earlier era that was defined by hardcore economic regulations, shifting borders, and this fierce, uncompromising protection of sovereignty. It's a phenomenal look at how a dominant regional power dictates the terms of engagement to a foreign corporate giant.
Okay, let's dive into this. By 1758, the Maratha Empire wasn't just some small regional kingdom. It was an absolute juggernaut. As you can see by the vast geographical scale we're dealing with here, their territory was sprawling. It literally dominated the Indian subcontinent. The sheer size of this empire sets up incredibly high stakes for our story. At this point in time, the British were basically stuck on the sidelines, confined to these little coastal factories and outposts, staring inland at this massive military and economic powerhouse. To survive, trade, and even dream of expanding, the British had to navigate around this formidable presence. This absolutely wasn't a meeting of equals. This was a corporate outpost trying to do business with an established, mighty empire. But let's rewind a bit from that peak expansion. Let's see how this crazy dynamic actually started. Because, well, it definitely didn't begin with polite, formal handshakes and grand courts. Actually, it kicked off with a really messy, chaotic chain reaction of clashes out on the water. The truth is, British and Maratha relations were already deeply strained long before the famous political encounters you might have heard of, like the meeting between Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and the general Afzal Khan. The real tension? That was brewing down in the ports and out on the seas, fueled by trade disruptions and a whole lot of military paranoia.
So here's how that initial domino effect played out. It all started when the general Afzal Khan marched his troops towards a coastal city of Dabhol. Well, this troop movement absolutely terrified a local merchant named Mahmud, who panicked and immediately fled with his ships to avoid the crossfire. Then, responding to Mahmud taking off, another commander, Fazl Khan, ordered those ships to be tracked down and moved over to the port of Rajapur. The Marathas were watching all of these erratic movements like a hawk. They swooped in, attacked Rajapur, and seized those very ships. Caught right in the middle of this unpredictable mess was another independent merchant, Abdul Karim. The Marathas unloaded his cargo during the seizure. It's kind of a dizzying sequence of events, right? But it perfectly captures just how volatile things were. One troop movement inland sparked this wild chain reaction of maritime panic and rapid retaliations.
So where on earth does the British East India Company fit into this specific chaos? Right smack in the middle of a tit-for-tat drama. After the Marathas seized the ships at Rajapur, the British flat-out refused to help get the merchant Abdul Karim's cargo released. But then, and here's the kicker, they used the surrounding chaos as cover to seize a completely different Maratha ship over some totally unrelated unpaid loan. It was an incredibly bold move, and man, the Marathas did not take it lightly. In direct retaliation, they went ahead and arrested the local British agent, a guy named Valaji. Now, Valaji and another British officer, Philip Giffard, were eventually let go, but the whole incident drew a massive line in the sand. The message was loud and clear. If foreign traders start local maritime skirmishes, they're going to face immediate arrests and strict local justice.
And things didn't cool down. The tensions soon escalated from those coastal skirmishes into some very active, high-stakes interference. Enter the brutal siege of Panela Fort. The Maratha leader, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, was trapped there by Siddhi Jahar's army. This was a literal life-or-death moment for the empire's leadership. So, what did the British officers do? Rather than staying out of it, guys like Revington, Giffard, and Valaji secretly supplied artillery ammunition to the enemy besieging the fort. Why would they risk that? Because they were absolutely certain Shivaji Maharaj wasn't going to make it out alive. They placed a massive corporate bet on his downfall, tossing aside any pretense of neutrality just to suck up to the army they figured was going to win.
But, as we all know, history loves a twist. Against literal all odds, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj successfully broke through the siege and escaped Panhala Fort. And, as you can probably guess, he didn't just forget who handed artillery to his enemies. The British East India Company's calculated corporate gamble blew up in their faces, spectacularly. This completely set the stage for a fierce, uncompromising retaliation the very next year. The entire dynamic of their relationship was about to flip on its head.
The payback was swift. In a military campaign at Rajapur, the Marathas decisively defeated the local British forces. They didn't just win a battle. They systematically rounded up the exact officers who had supplied the enemy. Henry Revington, Richard Taylor, Randolph Taylor, and Philip Gifford, all arrested. And they weren't just held for a few days. The Marathas threw them in prison for 2 whole years. This wasn't some minor diplomatic hiccup. It established a super strict legal precedent, proving that foreign agents operating in Maratha territory were 100% subject to local laws. You couldn't just use your status as a foreign traitor as a get-out-of-jail-free card for political meddling.
All right, let's fast forward a bit. After learning some seriously harsh lessons, the British realized they desperately needed a formal agreement if they were ever going to secure their trade and operate safely. Early on, a guy named Stephen Eustace tried to negotiate, but those talks completely failed. The Marathas absolutely refused to compromise their sovereignty. It wasn't until the pivotal 1674 coronation of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj that a real breakthrough happened. The British sent agent Henry Oxenden to negotiate directly at the coronation, and that finally led to a formal, written agreement on June 12.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how the Marathas handled diplomacy. It's a masterclass in balancing access with control. Looking at the terms, the British definitely got concessions. They got permission to trade in Surajia, the right to set up factories in places like Rajapur, Dabhol, Chal, and Kalyan, and they even got a guarantee that goods from wrecked ships would be returned. But, and this is a huge but, those concessions came with ironclad restrictions. The Marathas allowed the trade, sure, but they basically locked the British inside a really tight regulatory box. They extracted the economic benefits of international trade while heavily capping the actual influence of the traders.
Let's talk about a key piece of that regulatory box, the octroi. This was a local tax deliberately set at 2.5%, slapped onto any British goods brought into Maratha territory. And listen, this wasn't just about making a quick buck for the treasury. This was about power. It was a daily, structural enforcement of local authority. To put that into perspective, it meant every single piece of British merchandise crossing the border was financially contributing to the Maratha state. By enforcing this tax, the Marathas were constantly reminding the East India Company at every single transaction, hey, you are operating inside a sovereign state, and you play by our financial rules.
Beyond just taxing them, the treaty laid down a massive monetary rule. It explicitly banned the use of British coinage anywhere within the Maratha dominion. Think about the strategic genius of that for a second. By refusing to accept foreign money, the Marathas threw up an impenetrable financial barrier. The British were allowed to trade physical stuff, but they were legally blocked from setting up their own currency, which meant they couldn't build their own independent economic ecosystem. This was absolutely crucial. It stopped the East India Company from gaining that sneaky, subtle economic leverage that usually follows currency circulation. The financial control stayed firmly in local hands.
So what does this all mean? All these stipulations, the local taxes, the outright ban on their currency, and even forcing the British to accept external treaties like the one with the cities of Janjira, it was all part of one unified policy to safeguard Maratha's sovereignty. They essentially built a legal and economic fortress. The Marathas happily took the financial perks of trade, but they actively neutralized the political meddling and financial overreach that was basically the East India Company's signature move. It's really an amazing early historical blueprint for how a sovereign nation can regulate and contain corporate expansion through meticulous, uncompromising laws.
However, as we continue tracing this history through our source texts, things take a pretty dramatic turn in later generations. During that early era under Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, the rules were rock solid, zero tolerance for foreign meddling, period. But flash forward a bit, after the time of Chhatrapati Shahu Maharaj, into the era of Nana Sahib Peshwa, and the dynamic totally flipped. The British were no longer strictly contained to the coasts and their little factories. They actually managed to worm their way into Maratha political affairs, and get this, on one occasion, the Marathas even actively sought out British military help. That rigid wall of sovereignty and economic isolation had started to crack, which fundamentally changed the balance of power across the entire subcontinent.
Which leaves us with a truly massive historical what-if. If those later leaders had strictly maintained those early bans on foreign coinage, taxation, and political meddling, how might the entire timeline of the British Empire in India have changed? That early blueprint proved that the East India Company absolutely could be contained through uncompromising laws and strict enforcement. It's a pretty powerful reminder from our sources today of just how fast history can pivot when the fundamental rules of engagement start to slip. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history you think you know.